The dust kicked up by his boots settled slowly in the afternoon heat as Jake Morrison adjusted his rope with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. The leather felt familiar between his calloused fingers, worn smooth by countless hours of work with stubborn cattle and even more stubborn men. He was checking the knots when he heard it, a laugh like silver bells cutting through the prairie wind, followed by words that made his blood run both hot and cold. "Cowboy, your rope on top ties cattle, but the one below, what does it hold?" The voice belonged to Ayanna, a Comanche girl whose dark eyes sparkled with mischief and whose smile carried the kind of boldness that could start wars or end them. She stood just beyond the corral fence, her buckskin dress moving gently in the breeze, her long black hair catching the sunlight like strands of obsidian. There was something in the way she looked at him, not with the fear or suspicion most of her people showed toward white men, but with a curiosity that was both innocent and dangerously knowing. Jake felt his throat go dry. He'd faced down rustlers, survived stampedes, and stared death in the eye more times than he could count. But this slip of a girl with her teasing words had him more rattled than a green bronc in a thunderstorm. The rope in his hands suddenly felt heavier, more significant, as if it had transformed from a simple tool into something laden with meaning he wasn't sure he was ready to understand. Before we continue with this tale of forbidden attraction on the frontier, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more stories from the untamed American West, where love and danger walked hand in hand across the endless plains. The omniscient narrator reveals that in that moment, suspended between heartbeats, there was more than words hanging in the dusty air between them. Jake Morrison had always prided himself on being a man of simple needs and clear purposes. His rope served to catch cattle, secure loads, and occasionally string up the kind of men who deserved hanging. But as Ayanna's question echoed in his mind, he found himself thinking about other kinds of binding, other ways a man could find himself caught and held. The girl's laughter had not been innocent. It carried the boldness of someone who knew the boundaries of the frontier and understood exactly how to cross them. She was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, a leader who had negotiated an uneasy peace with the white settlers, allowing his people to remain on a small portion of their ancestral lands in exchange for cooperation with the territorial government. It was a fragile arrangement, one that could shatter like glass at the first sign of trouble. And trouble, Jake realized with growing certainty, was exactly what he was looking at. Ayanna stepped closer to the fence, her movements fluid and graceful as a deer approaching a stream. "You white men," she continued, her English accented but clear, "you think your ropes can hold everything. Cattle, horses, even men. But what about hearts, cowboy? What about dreams that run wild like mustangs across the plains?" Jake found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Miss, I reckon you're playing with fire. Your daddy wouldn't take kindly to you talking to a white man like this." Her smile widened, revealing teeth as white as fresh snow. "My father is wise, but he is not here. And fire, cowboy. Sometimes fire is exactly what the cold prairie needs." The wind picked up, swirling dust around them both, but it was the tension crackling between their gazes that truly set the air ablaze. Jake had heard stories about men who'd lost their minds over Indian women, who'd thrown away everything they'd built for a chance at something wild and untamed. He'd always thought them fools, but now, looking into Ayanna's dark eyes, he was beginning to understand their madness. In the Wild West, where ropes served to capture, to hang, or to save lives, that provocative question revealed that sometimes it wasn't cattle or men that needed taming. Sometimes it was the heart itself that proved the most dangerous territory of all. The days that followed that first encounter passed like a fever dream for Jake Morrison. He found himself riding closer to the Comanche settlement than his work required, always with some excuse, checking fence lines, looking for strays, scouting water sources. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was hoping to catch another glimpse of the girl who had turned his ordered world upside down with a single question. Ayanna, for her part, seemed to appear wherever he happened to be working. She would emerge from the tall grass like a spirit, sometimes alone, sometimes with other women from her tribe, who would giggle and whisper among themselves in their native tongue. But it was always Ayanna who would approach him, always Ayanna who would find new ways to challenge and tease him with her words. "Tell me, cowboy," she said one afternoon as he repaired a section of fence near the creek, that marked the boundary between white and Comanche land. Do you dream of ropes? Do they follow you even into sleep? Jake straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. I dream of many things, miss. Most of them a sight more peaceful than ropes. Peaceful dreams are for peaceful men, she replied, settling herself gracefully on a fallen log nearby. But you are not peaceful, are you, Jake Morrison? I have watched you. You carry storms inside you like the sky before the thunder comes. The fact that she knew his name shouldn't have surprised him. News traveled fast in these parts, and a new cowboy working for the Hendricks Ranch would be noted and discussed. But hearing it from her lips sent a jolt through him that he couldn't quite explain. How do you know so much about storms? He asked, setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. Ayana's expression grew more serious, though the spark never left her eyes. My people have lived with storms for generations, cowboy. We know how to read the signs in the wind, in the way the grass bends, in the behavior of animals, and we know that the most dangerous storms are not always the ones that come from the sky. She stood and moved closer, close enough that he could smell the sage and sweetgrass that seemed to cling to her hair and skin. Some storms come from the heart. Some storms come from wanting things that the world says you cannot have. Jake felt his pulse quicken. They were treading on dangerous ground now, speaking in metaphors that barely concealed the truth of what was growing between them. And what do your people do when those kinds of storms come? Sometimes, she said softly, we run from them. Sometimes we shelter and wait for them to pass. But sometimes, cowboy, sometimes we ride straight into the heart of the storm and see what it has to teach us. The creek bubbled and gurgled beside them, the only sound in a world that seemed to have gone suddenly quiet. Jake found himself reaching out, his fingers almost touching hers, before he caught himself and pulled back. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it might as well have been a declaration of war for all the danger it represented. This is madness, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Yes, she agreed, her voice equally soft. But madness and wisdom sometimes wear the same face, do they not? That evening, as Jake rode back to the ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. Behind him lay the life he had always known. Simple, hard, but predictable. Ahead lay something that could destroy everything he had worked for, everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. But as the sun set over the endless prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison found himself thinking not about the dangers that lay ahead, but about the way Ayana's eyes had looked in the fading light, and the promise of storms that might be worth riding into after all. The ranch house sat squat and weathered against the horizon, its windows glowing yellow in the gathering dusk. Jake unsaddled his horse with mechanical precision, his mind still churning with thoughts of dark eyes and dangerous words. He was so lost in his reverie that he almost didn't notice Tom Hendricks, waiting for him by the barn door, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. We need to talk, Morrison, the ranch owner said without preamble, and I reckon you know what about. Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Tom Hendricks was a fair man, but a practical one, and he had too much invested in maintaining peace with the local tribes to tolerate any cowboy who might upset that delicate balance. Jake hung up his saddle and followed his boss into the barn, where they could speak without being overheard by the other hands. I've been hearing stories, Hendricks began, taking a swig from the bottle before offering it to Jake. Stories about one of my men spending an awful lot of time near the reservation boundary. Stories about conversations that maybe shouldn't be happening. Jake accepted the whiskey but didn't drink. I've been doing my job, Mr. Hendricks. Checking fences, looking for strays, nothing more. Nothing more? Hendricks's laugh was bitter. Son, I've been in this territory for 20 years. I've seen what happens when white men start getting ideas about Indian women. I've seen the blood that gets spilled, the families that get torn apart, the peace treaties that get burned to ash because some fool couldn't keep his eyes where they belonged. The older man's words hit Jake like physical blows, but he forced himself to remain calm. I haven't done anything wrong. Maybe not yet, Hendricks conceded, but I can see which way the wind is blowing. That Comanche girl, Ayana, Chief Running Bear's daughter, she's been seen talking to you. More than once. More than is wise. Jake felt his jaw clench. She's a free person. She can talk to whoever she pleases. Free? Hendricks shook his head. Boy, you don't understand the first thing about how this world works. That girl isn't free any more than you are. She's the daughter of a chief who's walking a tightrope, between keeping his people alive and keeping them proud. One wrong step, one scandal, one excuse for the territorial government to decide that peace isn't profitable anymore, and her whole tribe could be marched off to some godforsaken reservation in Oklahoma. The weight of those words settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. He had been so caught up in the intoxicating pull of Ayana's presence that he hadn't fully considered the larger implications of their growing attraction. But now, faced with the stark reality of their situation, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying that if you care about that girl, really care about her, you'll stay away from her. I'm saying that some things in this world are bigger than what any one person wants or feels. And I'm saying that if you can't do that, if you can't put the greater good ahead of your own desires, then maybe it's time for you to find work somewhere else." Jake stared at the bottle in his hands, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. Everything Hendricks had said was true. He knew it in his bones. The peace between the white settlers and the Comanche was fragile, built on mutual necessity rather than trust or understanding. Any scandal involving the chief's daughter could shatter that peace like a gunshot through glass. But even as his rational mind accepted the logic of Hendricks' words, another part of him rebelled against the injustice of it all. Why should he and Ayana be denied the chance to explore what was growing between them simply because of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth? Why should fear and prejudice dictate the boundaries of the heart? "I understand what you're saying," Jake said finally, "but understanding something and accepting it are two different things." Hendricks studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I reckon they are. But sometimes, son, acceptance is the only choice we've got if we want to keep living in this world instead of dying for our principles." As Jake walked back to the bunkhouse that night, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like a physical burden, he found himself thinking about ropes again, about the different kinds of binding that could hold a man, and the different kinds of freedom that came with cutting yourself loose. But some ropes, he was beginning to understand, were tied to more than just yourself, and cutting them might mean destroying everything and everyone you claimed to care about. The storm that Ayana had spoken of was coming, and Jake Morrison was no longer sure whether he had the strength to ride into it or the wisdom to run away. The confrontation came 3 weeks later, on a day when the autumn wind carried the scent of change across the prairie. Jake had been avoiding the Boundary Creek, throwing himself into work on the far side of the ranch, but fate and circumstance conspired to bring him face to face with the choice he had been dreading. He was riding back from checking the north pasture when he heard the gunshots. 3 quick cracks that echoed across the flatland like thunder. His horse's ears pricked forward, and Jake spurred the animal toward the sound, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. As he crested a low rise, he saw them, 5 white men on horseback, surrounding a lone Comanche woman who stood defiantly beside her fallen horse. Even at a distance, Jake recognized the proud set of her shoulders, the way she held her head high despite the obvious danger. Ayana. The men were settlers from town, Jake realized as he drew closer, the kind of men who saw the Indian treaties as temporary inconveniences and the Comanche presence as an insult to their vision of manifest destiny. Their leader was Bull Garrett, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his hatred for anyone whose skin wasn't the same color as his own. "Well, well," Garrett was saying as Jake approached, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Look what we got here, boys. A little Indian princess, all alone and far from home." Ayana stood perfectly still, but Jake could see the tension in her posture, the way her hand hovered near the knife at her belt. Her horse lay motionless beside her, blood seeping from a wound in its neck. They had shot it out from under her, leaving her stranded and vulnerable. "My father will hear of this," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "The treaty guarantees safe passage for my people." Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Treaties are just paper, girl, and paper burns real easy when the wind changes direction." Jake's mind raced as he calculated distances and odds. 5 armed men against 1 woman, and now against him, if he chose to intervene. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to ride away and report what he had seen to the territorial marshal. But by the time help arrived, it would be too late for Ayana. The choice when it came felt like no choice at all. "That's far enough, Garrett," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the prairie as he rode into the circle of men. "The lady's under my protection now." The silence that followed was deafening. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward him, measuring, calculating, deciding whether he represented a threat or merely an inconvenience. Garrett's face split into a grin that held no warmth whatsoever. "Well, if it isn't Jake Morrison," he said, "Tom Hendricks's new boy. I heard you'd been spending time with the savages, but I didn't think you'd gone completely native." Jake dismounted slowly, his hands visible but ready to move toward his gun if necessary. "I said she's under my protection. That means you boys need to ride on out of here before this gets ugly." "Ugly?" Garrett's laugh was harsh. "Boy, you don't know the meaning of the word, but you're about to learn." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring, 5 men against 1, with Ayanna caught in the middle. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, the knowledge that whatever happened in the next few minutes would change everything. For him, for her, for the fragile piece that held this corner of the territory together. But as he looked into Ayanna's eyes and saw not fear but fierce pride and something that might have been love, Jake Morrison realized that some choices were worth making regardless of the consequences. Some storms were worth riding into, even if they destroyed you in the process. His hand moved toward his gun, and the world exploded into violence and gunfire, the sound echoing across the endless prairie like the breaking of all the promises that had ever been made between peoples who could never truly understand each other. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds, but those moments stretched like hours in Jake's memory. His first shot took Garrett in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending him tumbling from his saddle. The other 4 men scattered, seeking cover behind their horses, and returning fire with the desperate fury of men who had expected an easy victory and found themselves in a real fight. Jake rolled behind a boulder, bullets whining off the stone inches from his head. Ayanna had found cover behind her dead horse, and he could see her knife glinting in her hand, ready to fight if any of the men came close enough. The sight of her courage in the face of such danger filled him with a fierce protectiveness that burned hotter than rage. "You made a big mistake." "Morrison!" Garrett shouted from where he lay bleeding in the dirt. "You think you can protect that savage whore? You think her daddy's going to thank you for starting a war?" Jake's response was another bullet that kicked up dust inches from Garrett's head. "Only war here is the one you started when you shot her horse." The battle might have continued until someone was dead, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats changed everything. A dozen Comanche warriors appeared on the horizon, riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. At their head rode Chief Running Bear himself, his face a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. The white men's bravado evaporated like morning mist. Faced with the prospect of fighting a dozen seasoned warriors instead of one lone cowboy, they began backing toward their horses, their weapons still drawn but their confidence shattered. "This isn't over, Morrison," Garrett snarled as his men helped him into his saddle. "You've chosen your side, and it ain't the winning one." As the settlers retreated, Jake found himself facing a different kind of danger. Chief Running Bear dismounted and walked slowly toward him, his dark eyes unreadable. The other warriors remained mounted but alert, their weapons ready but not yet raised. "You fought for my daughter," the chief said in careful English. "Why?" Jake holstered his gun and met the older man's gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because no woman should face 5 armed men alone. Because—" he glanced at Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Because she matters to me." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Chief Running Bear studied Jake for a long moment, then looked at his daughter, who had risen from behind her dead horse and now stood straight and proud despite the dirt on her dress and the fear she had just endured. "You know what this means," the chief said finally. "You know what you have chosen." Jake nodded slowly. "I reckon I do." "Then you also know that there can be no going back. The white men will not forgive you for taking the side of the Comanche. And my people—" he paused, his gaze shifting to his daughter. "My people will not easily accept a white man among them, even one who has proven his courage." "I understand," Jake said, "but some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once sharply. "We will speak more of this, but first my daughter needs a horse and you need to decide whether you are ready to leave your old life behind forever." As the Comanche warriors prepared to escort them back to the settlement, Jake caught Ayanna's eye. She smiled at him. Not the teasing, provocative smile he had grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more serious, something that spoke of gratitude and affection, and the recognition that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The rope that had started as a simple tool for catching cattle had become something far more complex, a bond that tied him not just to Ayana, but to her people, to a way of life that was foreign to everything he had ever known. It was a binding that would cost him everything he had built in the white world. But as he looked at the woman who had challenged him with her laughter and her courage, Jake Morrison found that he was ready to pay that price. The storm had come at last, and he was riding straight into its heart. 6 months later, as spring returned to the prairie and the grass grew green and tall, Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the Comanche settlement and watched his wife tend to their small garden. Ayana moved among the plants with the same grace she had shown that first day by the corral fence, but there was a contentment in her movements now that spoke of a woman who had found her place in the world. The path to this moment had not been easy. Jake had been forced to leave the Hendricks Ranch, his reputation among the white settlers destroyed by his choice to defend a Comanche woman against his own kind. Chief Running Bear had demanded that he prove his commitment not just through words but through actions, learning the language, understanding the customs, demonstrating that his love for Ayana was more than mere infatuation with the exotic. There had been challenges from within the tribe as well. Some of the younger warriors had seen his presence as an insult, a reminder of the white world's encroachment on their traditional way of life. It had taken time, patience, and more than one physical confrontation to earn their grudging respect. But the hardest test had come from Ayana herself. Once the immediate danger had passed and the reality of their situation had set in, she had pulled away from him, questioning whether his feelings were real or simply the result of the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together. It had taken months of patient courtship, of proving that he saw her not as a prize to be won, but as a partner to be cherished, before she had finally agreed to become his wife. Now, as he watched her laugh at something one of the other women had said, Jake felt a contentment he had never known in his previous life. The work was different here, less about cattle and more about survival, about maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and the changing world around them. But it was honest work, meaningful work, and he had found a purpose that went beyond mere survival. "You are thinking deep thoughts, my husband," Ayana said, approaching him with a smile that still had the power to make his heart race. "What occupies your mind on this beautiful day?" Jake reached out and took her hand, marveling as always at the way her fingers fit perfectly with his. "I was thinking about ropes," he said, and she laughed. The same silver bell sound that had first captured his attention all those months ago. "Still thinking about ropes? After all this time?" "Different kinds of ropes now," he said, pulling her closer. "The kind that bind hearts instead of cattle. The kind that hold families together instead of holding prisoners. The kind that connect us to something larger than ourselves." Ayana's expression grew more serious, though the warmth never left her eyes. "And do you regret the binding, Cowboy? Do you ever wish you could cut yourself free and return to your old life?" Jake considered the question, looking out over the settlement, where children played and elders shared stories, and life continued in its ancient rhythms, despite the changes pressing in from all sides. He thought about the ranch he had left behind, the simple certainties of his former existence, the price he had paid for choosing love over safety. "No," he said finally, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Some ropes are meant to hold. Some bindings make you more free, not less." As the sun set over the endless prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison held his wife close and thought about the question that had started it all. The rope on top had indeed tied cattle, but the one below, the invisible cord that connected heart to heart and soul to soul, that rope held something far more precious. It held love. It held hope. It held the promise that even in a world divided by fear and prejudice, two people could find each other across the vast distances that separated their worlds and create something new, something beautiful, something worth fighting for. The cowboy's rope had finally found its true purpose, and Jake Morrison had found his home.